Hi, my name is Marissa Seymour, and this is my hemoglobin binding presentation. So what exactly is hemoglobin? It's essentially, like how are we able to breathe in oxygen and then actually release carbon dioxide back into the environment, and that whole process kind of happened over and over again. And that's because of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a protein found in our red blood cells that is essentially responsible for transporting oxygen from our lungs to all over our body, um, depositing that oxygen, and then picking up CO2 and then returning back to the lungs so that our body can exhale that CO2 back out into the environment. Um, Talking about the hemoglobin molecule, it combined with four oxygen molecules, which allows it to efficiently and sufficiently transport oxygen throughout the entire body. The hemoglobin also plays a role in the shape of red blood cells, giving them that nice, firm, brown, circular shape. That's going to be crucial for them to be able to navigate through our capillaries. So when we have that hemoglobin in the body, and we kind of talk about oxygen binding, um, that hemoglobin has four subunits that essentially contain a heme group and an iron at the center of it. Uh, and that oxygen is able to actually bond four times to that heme group. Essentially, it's got the iron atom in the middle, and then the heme groups around that iron atom, which allows for the oxygen to bind there, what we call it the actual binding site, for a total of four. When we inhale, we are taking oxygen into our lungs, and that essentially diffuses into the bloodstream and then binds to an iron atom in those heme groups, and we kind of term that oxygen binding. Um, and then by binding that one oxygen molecule, we increase the affinity of the remaining heme groups, which makes it essentially easier for that hemoglobin to pick up more oxygen. That's kind of the term cooperative binding that we bring into play. I really like this picture over here that kind of shows it on a molecular and cellular level about a red blood cell. It gets oxygen from the lungs, so it's oxygen rich. It leaves the lungs, it starts traveling to those capillaries that are not rich in oxygen, um, and other parts of the body where there's higher points of carbon dioxide, and it essentially releases those oxygen molecules to areas that need it, like our organs and tissues, and then kind of picks up carbon dioxide and returns back to our lungs. So blood travels to tissues in the body where oxygen concentration is low, and then that hemoglobin is going to release those oxygen molecules there. When there is sort of a low pressure of oxygen in those tissues, the hemoglobin will actually change shape a little bit uh, to help release those molecules when they're needed, and it kind of does a little overall structural change in the molecule, and then they will essentially drop off that oxygen to, again, places that need it, like tissues and organs, and then pick up CO2 in those areas because it's higher concentration of carbon dioxide there and hydrogen ions. And then they essentially travel back to the lungs where CO2 is released, and we kind of exhale that CO2 back out into the air. So for binding capacity, in terms of lungs versus capillaries, in our lungs, again, we breathe in oxygen, we intake oxygen, so our concentration is very high of oxygen, and we have a high partial pressure there because there is so much oxygen. It's essentially excited and ready to kind of bind with the heme groups, and we consider that hemoglobin fully saturated with oxygen when it's in the lungs there. Now, when they leave the lungs and enter into the capillaries, this is obviously where the lower oxygen concentration is at. There's higher levels of CO2, and it's just not oxygen rich like your lungs are. And that partial pressure actually goes to less than half of what it was when it was in the lungs. So that affinity kind of really, really decreases, but allows for the release of oxygen from that hemoglobin. Again, kind of a good picture here of showing those red blood cells leaving the lungs. They're oxygen rich. They've got the oxygen molecules on them. They're essentially dropping those oxygen molecules off to tissues here, organ cells that need them, picking back up carbon dioxide in return, and then kind of returning back to the lungs there. When that first oxygen molecule will bind to the heme group, it kind of goes through a conformational change where it increases that affinity, again, making it so much easier to pick up those O2 molecules in our lungs because there's so much oxygen there. It's so abundant, it's easier to pick them up. It's almost sticking to it, if you will. And then again, that hemoglobin travels outside of the lungs where it has a lower concentration of O2 available, and kind of undergoes another conformational change and decreases in affinity, making it easier to release those O2 in those capillaries. And I like this picture here with the diagram because it kind of shows how that red blood cell will change shapes a little bit, going from that firm circle to kind of flattening a little bit so that it is easier to navigate through those capillaries. For pH levels in our lungs and capillaries, we use kind of the Bohr effect to talk about how the changes in pH and CO2 concentration will essentially affect the hemoglobin's affinity on our O2 levels. So the more acidic an environment an area is, there's going to be more carbon dioxide there. That concentration of that will be higher. So the hemoglobin's oxygen binding affinity will decrease because it's not going to want to uptake oxygen. It's going to want to release it. It's going to want to give it away. And so in our lungs, they are less acidic than our capillaries, about a 7.4 range. And so again, in the lungs, it just shows with that pH that it's again easier to bind to those O2 molecules because it's not in an acidic environment. Whereas with the capillaries, it's slightly more acidic from that. And again, just kind of tying it back into how versus uptaking those oxygen molecules, it's going to release those oxygen to the tissue and surrounding areas. And then for our last point here about carbon dioxide interaction with water, obviously as the hemoglobin and blood cells are flowing through the body, they're going to come in contact with water. Our bodies are made up of so much water, so when that carbon dioxide will actually interact with water inside the capillaries, it forms something that we call carbonic acid. Um, and that carbonic acid will essentially dissociate into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, making it more acidic in that entire environment. And again, affects the pH, makes it more acidic. Now the oxygen can't uptake, it's just going to be released. And ultimately, if we can't release that O2 into tissues in our body, we're not able to go through the process of cellular respiration, which is how we breathe. We intake oxygen, intake glucose, process it inside of our body and release it as carbon dioxide and water without kind of moving that O2 around in our bodies and getting it to places it needs. We can't essentially go through that whole process there, and we can't breathe. Thank you.